If you watched the second video on Mill, you saw that there were some significant criticisms that appeared to be problematic. Now, Kant actually lived before Mill. You see his dates there. He passed a couple of years before Mill was born. But we could understand his theory as addressing the weaknesses of utilitarianism. So we'll get to that toward the end of the video. The primary text for Kant's moral theory is his Foundations of the Metaphysics of Morals. And yes, it's about as hard to read as the title makes it sound. But I'll do my best to make sure we understand the most important parts of the text. First of all, Kant is concerned with laying out an a priori basis for ethics, one that is based on reason alone. That phrase, a priori, is a Latin phrase, and roughly it means prior to experience. The idea is that through your own reason, you can think through a problem carefully and solve it. Most of mathematics is done by a priori reasoning. You don't have to go out and investigate the world in any particular way. You don't have to have experiences of any particular type. So it's reasoning prior to having particular experiences. Of course, this is very unlike Mill. With Mill, I said he would probably love to live in the 21st century, not only to develop utilitarian apps for your phone, but he would love the cognitive science and the technology we have available, and he would integrate that into his moral theory. Mill took a very empirical approach to his philosophy, but Kant does not. In contrast with Mill, Kant takes a deontological approach instead of a teleological approach like Mill did. The teleos, part of that word teleological that Mill used, that's a Greek word for end or purpose. And we saw that Mill was focusing on results or the consequences of one's actions to evaluate the morality of the action. Kant takes this deontological approach, and the root deontos of deontological is a Greek word meaning law or rule. His focus is on fulfilling a duty or a responsibility more than what can be accomplished. So we're not looking at the results, we're looking at fulfilling one's duties. Now, Kant emphasizes a good will. And in order to understand this, let's consider well-scripted, imposing villains from fiction. So I'm talking about Darth Vader, Hannibal Lecter, the Joker, the Green Goblin, the original Terminator, Thanos, Voldemort, yes, I said his name, Cruella de Vil, the White Witch in the Narnia series, or Shredder going after those poor adolescent turtles. For all of these villains, they are evil, dangerous, horrible people you don't want to be around. However, it's also true for all of them that they have a few characteristics that we value. They have great talent. Some of them are very wealthy. Some of them are very disciplined and persistent toward reaching a goal. Some have good looks. Others are really strong. Most of them are very smart. In other words, they have skills and talents and resources that we value and seek and would like to have for ourselves. The problem is that all of those things can be misused. Okay, Kant didn't actually talk about the villains we just mentioned, but he reflected and realized that everything humans value in character traits, the positive traits that villains have, can be misused. That is, every trait can be misused except one, having a good will. And Kant says that nothing is good without qualification except a good will. Having a good will means that someone has the intentions to do what is right. We now have two things that are driving Kant's moral theory. First, we have duties to fulfill, responsibilities that we have, rules to follow. Okay, that's one driving force for his moral theory. But then we also have this desire, this motive to do what is right. So nothing is good without qualification, but the goodwill is intending to do what is right. That's what we value according to Kant. That's what makes something morally worthy. So, what makes something good? Let's again contrast this with Mill. For Kant, it's what motivates the action. So the idea is, if you're motivated by fulfilling your duty and doing the right thing, that makes that action good. Contrast that with Mill, where motives weren't really much of a concern at all. Instead, it was all about the results of the matter. So we have the motive for the action, right? What occurs prior to the action. That's the most important thing for Kant. The results, what happens after the action, is the most important thing for Mill. So now let's consider a person that's shooting a gun, or maybe somebody who's giving correct change at a grocery store. And the difference between Mill and Kant is Mill is focused entirely on the results, whereas Kant is focused on the motive or the duty that one has in the situation, the rules that one needs to follow. Now, I explain this in a separate short video titled Kant versus Mill, so you could see it explained more thoroughly there. But because the emphasis on the motive and fulfilling one's responsibility, as a consequence, a result of that, two people might do the very same thing in the same situation with the same results, but be evaluated differently in terms of the morality of their actions. According to Mill, they've done something equally good. There's no other way to measure it but the results. But according to Kant, one of the persons might be doing what is right and valued, while the other is doing something that has no moral value, or may even be morally wrong. Consider someone shooting a gun. Why are they shooting the gun? Are they shooting it at an innocent person in order to cause chaos? Are they shooting at a gun to protect an innocent person who's about to be attacked by a bear? Those are two very different things, and the motive for shooting the gun is significant. Or consider a more mundane situation of giving correct change, and Kant talks about this. Kant's concerned with the motive that one has. So some people might be motivated to give the correct change just because that's good for business. They want to protect their reputation. They don't want to be caught ripping off someone. For Kant, that's not morally good. It doesn't have any moral value. No, it's not morally bad either. But if your motive is to do the right thing and follow the rules and always give correct change, then Kant says it has moral value. The motive for the action determines the objective moral worth of the action. So Kant's idea is that a good action, one that's motivated for good, is one that's done for the sake of moral law. Now let's explore what we mean by that. Kant identifies what he calls the categorical imperative. This is the moral law. A categorical imperative has no if clause. It's not conditional and it doesn't vary. It's universally binding on all rational beings. It's the law. Kant actually has 5 different formulations of the categorical imperative. He argues that all 5 of them are logically equivalent, that is, they ultimately mean the same thing. We're just going to look at the first 2 formulations, and we'll see some slight differences that I think are significant, and clearly the wording is quite different. The first formulation of the categorical imperative is that one should act only on that maxim that you can consistently will to be a universal law. The parts of the statement that are underlined, maxim, consistently will, universal law, these are parts that we need to think about more clearly and make sure we thoroughly understand those words and phrases. Now, before we do that, let me just say that the first formulation of the categorical imperative is similar to the golden rule in this way. It asks that we not make a moral exception of ourselves, right? That we treat everyone equally, including ourselves. But of course, there's much more to it than that. As Kant uses the idea, a maxim is a practical rule for actions. It can be fairly particular to one situation, but it's something that you can make into a universal law. So here's an example of a maxim that Kant considers in order to evaluate it. He asked, is this something that passes the categorical imperative? So this is a test case maxim. When I find myself in need of money, I will borrow, I will promise to repay it, even though I know I won't be able to pay it back. Now, of course, on the surface, this does not sound morally right, but it helps to think through why Kant would say this is problematic. Kant says it's problematic because it's not even possible that the maxim could be a universal law. And this is a question we need to be asking. In this case, imagine a world where everybody acts according to this maxim. Whenever they find themselves in need of money, they're going to borrow, promise to repay, and even though they know they're not going to be paying it back, they still do it. What would have happened if everyone did that? If we made this a universal law that everyone followed? Well, first of all, people would quit loaning money. Banks would probably go bankrupt and out of business. Eventually, the ultimate end of this is that no one's going to loan any money because loaning no longer has any meaning. People will say they're going to pay it back, but they never do. So we can extend this to its logical end. If no one is loaning any money, then of course no one can borrow any money. And that means it's actually impossible for everyone to follow this principle, because it's going to be impossible for anyone to borrow if this principle were made universal. So it's not even possible that it be a universal law. It's the very nature of promising that it requires that one expect another to fulfill an obligation. A promise involves a pledge to do something and a belief on the other party that the action will be done. Both aspects are necessary, but if everyone began borrowing and never repaying, then it wouldn't make any sense, right? I could promise that I'm going to jump to the moon, but it doesn't matter what follows that. You know that I'm not going to jump to the moon, so you really can't consider that a promise, right? It just doesn't work that way. It's a little bit like the boy who cried wolf. So you know the story. He gets bored. He called out that there's going to be a wolf coming, and everybody scurried around to save the sheep, and he finds it more interesting that way. And initially people believed him, but he kept doing it. And it didn't take long until no one believed him anymore. At that point, it became impossible for him to warn anyone of the approaching wolf. It was impossible because he could yell and scream wolf all he wanted, and no one was going to believe him. Now, that's somewhat similar to the situation of borrowing and promising to repay, but never paying it back, right? If everyone does that, then no one can ultimately do it, right? No one can ultimately borrow. It just undermines the whole idea of borrowing. So it can't be a universal law for that reason. And so according to Kant, we know it's immoral. It's immoral because it doesn't pass the categorical imperative. It can't be a universal law. The next part of the categorical imperative that we consider is to act only on the maxim that you can consistently will that it be a universal law. So Kant has another case for us to consider in this situation. I'll call it the case of anti-philanthropy, right? The maxim is, when I'm well off and my needs are taken care of, I will not regard others who may be in need. Instead, I'll just enjoy my own status. And if somebody comes and asks me for money, I'm not going to give anyone any money, even though I'm well off and they may have a great need, right? So that's the maxim there. It's the opposite of somebody being a philanthropist, right? So we might ask, like we just tested with the previous maxim, could it be a universal law, right? It seems to be, yes, it could. It could be a universal law. It's possible for everyone to follow the maxim. Now, some will never be very well off, but whenever anyone is, they could act in this way. It's logically possible that everybody lives by this principle. Now, a consequence is going to be the population is going to drop off. People are going to die because other people aren't giving to causes that help keep people alive. That's going to be a consequence, but it still could be a universal law. It still could be a way that everyone lives. The problem is, it's not a maxim that anyone could consistently will, right? Nobody actually wants everyone to live this way. So consider the ancient Hebrew proverb that says, "He who shuts his ear to the cry of the poor will also cry himself and not be answered." Kant actually relies on that kind of an idea. The problem with saying that you're never going to give to someone in need is that eventually you might be a person in need of somebody else's help. Now, especially in Kant's time, a disaster might happen and wipe out all of your wealth. A tornado might come through. You may need shelter and food and somebody to take care of you. And you would obviously want somebody who has their needs taken care of, who has the means to assist you to do that. That's what you would want. So you can't consistently will that everybody act in this way, according to this maxim. That's not something you can really want. Now, as I mentioned, there is a second formulation of the categorical imperative. That's the CI, we abbreviate it just CI. And it says, so act as to treat humanity in every case as an end and never as a means only. Now, I've actually smoothed out the English in both of these cases, just a little bit from our translation, but we're keeping the same structure and same idea. So the main idea for the second formulation is that you should treat every person as an end and never as a means only. So that means you respect individuals as having value in themselves. You never use others merely to accomplish an end for your own purposes. So this provides us with a basis for handling some of the examples that that gave Mill a difficult time, right? Mill's theory. So recall the peeping Tom example that we presented as a criticism of Mill. This guy is spying on his neighbor. He enjoys watching her. He's using her, but she doesn't know about it. Well, it's still wrong because he's not treating her as an end. She is a means to his pleasure only. And the second formulation of the categorical imperatives explains why that's wrong. You're not respecting the individual as having value. Now, also the other case we mentioned as a significant problematic case of injustice for Mill was a situation where somebody was an unwilling donor. The poor guy had appendicitis and then his organs were harvested. Now, in that case, the physician doing those transplants is using the person merely as an end to accomplish the means of getting organs so that somebody else could survive. It violates the second formulation of the categorical imperative. Now, I would qualify this in one respect. Does this mean that you can never use another person at all? No. The limit here is that you are not merely to treat them as a means. In order to clarify the difference, consider going to the store to buy some milk. Okay, you want milk, the store's a means for you to get milk. They want your money, and you as your customer are a means for them to get money. It's an equally mutual exchange. Both are freely engaging in the process. You get what you want, they get what they want. And as long as you're not abusing them or trying to steal the milk or something like that, then you're not treating them as a means only, right? And that's consistent with the second formulation of the categorical imperative. Now, there are some clear advantages of Kant's moral theory. First of all, since it's based on a priori reasoning, it's universally applicable. It can apply in all situations for all people. It's not limited in any way to various circumstances, and the principles you come up with are going to be the same principles for anyone at any time. A second advantage is that strict duties allow for easier decision making. A criticism of Mill's theory is that it was too hard to apply, too hard to figure out what to do, how many people are going to be happy, how many people might be in pain. With Kant's moral theory, you reflect, you run it through the categorical imperative, you see what's proper and right, and then you fulfill your duty. Once you figure out the rules, you just continue to follow those same rules. Third, Kant says that humans have infinite worth, and that means they should never be used as a means only. Kant's theory certainly supports the idea and is based on that idea. Fourth, Kant's theory affirms universal moral rights. So all people, no matter what their circumstances are, have moral rights. His theory applies to everyone equally. It's fair in that sense of fairness that we seek in our culture. We want to treat everyone equally. And Kant's moral theory gives us a basis to do that. Now, in the second video on Kant, I'll consider some criticisms of his theory.